Smoke pressed low like a memory that refused to lift as Ethan Cole pushed the scorched door. Plaster snowed from the ceiling. Ethan said, "It still smells like last winter." A red LED blinked on a melted answering machine. He froze. A new voicemail waited under soot. Ethan said, "Dad is gone. Why am I shaking?" Sirens swelled outside, distant but closing like jaws. The hallway coughed sparks. He stepped over a fallen lamp. Paper curled on the desk, edges embered, a letter sealed in wax. Ethan said, "This can't be real." He cracked the seal and saw his family name in his father's careful hand. The message spoke of a debt, a choice, a night long buried. Ethan said, "You didn't abandon me." The floor popped, a board split, and his reflection wavered in a blackened photo frame. He tasted copper on his tongue. A shadow inside him hissed that love was a trick. The phone beeped again, insisting. Ethan pressed play. His father's voice spilled out, tender, urgent. Ethan said, "I hear you." A beam sagged. Heat rose like a verdict. He tucked the letter in his jacket and ran for the door as the ceiling gave its first warning groan. Rain hammered the curb as Ethan staggered into the street. Paramedics shouted triage codes. "Oh," Ethan said, "I'm fine," but his hands shook like wires. He felt the letter against his ribs, a second heartbeat. The voicemail's last words looped in his skull. A firefighter thrust a blanket at him and guided him toward the ambulance step. Ethan said, "I can't sit. I need a pen. I need the rest of it." The shadow of doubt pressed in and whispered that the voice was a trick. He watched steam pour from the doorway where his life had burned thinner. A neighbor filmed in silence, blue light painting their faces. Ethan said, "He stayed for me." Sirens cut, and a wet hush fell. He tasted rain and ash, equal parts memory and promise. An EMT checked his pupils and nodded. Ethan said, "There's a letter," and the EMT wrote it on a clipboard like a wound. He held the blanket tighter, not for warmth but for gravity. Somewhere a dog barked once and then stopped, as if even it knew something had changed. Under the tented awning, Ethan replayed the voicemail from memory as if each word might vanish if he blinked. He thought of the wax, the careful script, the silence between syllables. Ethan said, "You chose me over yourself." A firefighter logged times and temperatures, and did not look up. The shadow inside tried to laugh, but it sounded tired. Ethan said, "You didn't run." He ran a thumb over a blister on his palm, and felt the sting like proof. A paramedic offered hot tea in a paper cup. Steam rose like a prayer. Ethan said, "He kept a promise I never knew." The neighbor lowered the phone at last. The awning shook as wind bullied the poles. Ethan said, "I'm going to find the rest." The city's neon bled into puddles, twisting into threads that looked like paths. He followed each to an end that wasn't an end. The tent lights hummed. Somewhere, a printer spat forms. Ethan said, "Tonight is the start," and the words steadied him more than the blanket ever could. Dawn threatened the edges of the clouds as a rideshare carried Ethan across the river. He watched smoke stain the horizon like old regret. Ethan said, "I need answers where the living gather." The map pulsed a blue route to a free clinic where a counselor he once ghosted volunteered on Thursdays. He had mocked the idea of healing then. The seat belt cut across his chest and found the letters outline. Ethan said, "No more delays." The driver glanced in the mirror and said nothing, which felt like a blessing. Streetlights blinked out one by one, surrendering to gray. Ethan imagined a door opening and a patient voice saying his name without judgment. The shadow muttered, "That door's close." Ethan said, "Not all of them." The river flashed dull silver, and for a second he saw the photo on his wall whole again. The car slowed near the clinic steps. He paid, pocketed the receipt like a talisman, and pressed the letter flat against his heart. The clinic door sighed as Ethan entered, and warm light folded around him. Reception tapped keys with a rhythm that felt human. Ethan said, "I need to see Mara Lynn," and the name softened the room. He had met her once, then vanished into excuses. The receptionist nodded and slid a form. Pens clinked like coins. Ethan said, "I lost something, and I found something worse." A humidifier whispered. In the hallway, a poster promised that broken was not the end. The shadow recoiled, then gathered itself. Ethan said, "I brought a letter," as if a document could anchor a storm. A door opened, and the scent of tea drifted out. Footsteps approached with unhurried certainty. Ethan said, "If you still have time," and the voice that answered was steady, warm, and real. His shoulders lowered a fraction. The waiting room hush pressed its palm to his pulse. Somewhere a kettle clicked off, and it sounded like permission. The office smelled faintly of chamomile, and Ethan sat stiffly on the edge of the chair. Mara Lynn, calm and composed, studied him with patient eyes. Ethan said, "I don't know why I'm here, but I couldn't stay away." A clock ticked softly, each second a reminder of time he thought he had wasted. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than his body. Mara said, "You came because something shifted." Her voice was steady, not accusing. Ethan said, "I heard his voice. My father, he didn't leave like I thought." His throat tightened, and the shadow whispered that hope was poison. Mara folded her hands unhurried and said, "Sometimes the past demands to be understood, not erased." Ethan leaned forward, rubbing his temples, as if pressing pain into submission. He said, "I hated him for years, and maybe I hated myself more." A quiet hum from the heater filled the silence. Mara nodded once and said, "That's where we begin, where you hurt the most." Ethan lowered his gaze and let himself stay in the chair. Mara placed a small notepad on the table, untouched, as if waiting for Ethan to decide its purpose. He said, "I can't stop hearing his voice. It's like he's alive again, demanding I listen." His breath hitched as memory pressed like smoke in his lungs. Mara said, "Voices of the past aren't ghosts. They are messages waiting for meaning." Ethan frowned, his jaw tight, and said, "Or maybe they're tricks my mind bending to loneliness." Rain began tapping against the window pane, soft but insistent. Mara leaned slightly forward and said, "When pain speaks, we must decide whether to silence it or learn from it." Ethan said, "What if learning breaks me more than silence ever could?" The heater clicked, filling the pause. Mara smiled faintly and said, "Breaking is not the end. Sometimes it's the start of wisdom." Ethan exhaled slowly, fingers tracing the seam of his jeans. For the first time he did not argue. The silence stretched, broken only by Ethan's breathing. He said, "When I was 12, I waited by the door every night, thinking he'd come back. Every creak in the hallway, I believed it was him." His voice trembled, and the shadow whispered cruel reminders of waiting in vain. Mara said, "The child in you still waits. He deserves to be heard." Ethan pressed his palms to his eyes, as if blocking the image of his younger self. He said, "I can't forgive a man who never explained." Mara leaned back, her presence steady as stone, and said, "Forgiveness is not surrender. It is freedom from carrying what is not yours." Ethan dropped his hands and looked at her, eyes rimmed red. He said, "If I let go, who am I without the anger?" The question cracked something inside him. Mara's silence was the answer, letting him find it himself. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low. He said, "I told everyone he abandoned us. I built my identity around that wound." His throat tightened as he forced the words out. Mara said, "Sometimes wounds become walls. When walls fall, we see what lies beyond." Ethan said, "And if what I see is worse?" The rain picked up, beating harder on the window as if echoing his fear. Mara's gaze did not waver. She said, "Truth can hurt, but it does not destroy. Lies destroy. Silence destroys. Truth frees." Ethan swallowed and said, "I'm afraid to let go of the story I've told about him, about me." His fingers gripped the arm of the chair until his knuckles paled. Mara nodded and said, "Fear shows us what matters most." Ethan felt the words sink deeper than he wanted, but he did not turn away. The heater clicked off, leaving the room in hushed stillness. Ethan said, "He told me to choose. I don't even know what he meant, but I can't stop thinking about it." He pressed his hand against his chest, where the letter lay folded. Mara said, "Choice is a mirror. It shows us who we are becoming." Ethan shook his head and said, "I've been running from mirrors all my life." His laugh was short, jagged, and hollow. Mara said, "Then perhaps it is time to stop running." Her words fell like anchors, steadying him. He looked at her, searching for contradiction, but finding only patience. Ethan said, "I'm not ready, but I can't leave it buried either." The clock ticked again, steady and inevitable. Mara nodded and said, "Read the letter when you are willing to face yourself, not when you fear yourself." Ethan breathed deeply, and for the first time, allowed silence to feel like a companion. By noon the rain had thinned to a mist, and the building wore its blackened scars like a warning no one would read twice. Ethan said, "5 minutes, that's all I need," and the inspector lifted a brow. The clipboard man smelled of wet wool and verdicts. Colin Ward said, "Evidence is fragile, and so are stories." The shadow in Ethan's chest grinned at that, and urged him to leave. Ethan said, "There's a letter and a tape, and they belong to me." He watched yellow tape flutter like a tired flag, then stepped closer to the ash. Colin sighed and said, "You sign a waiver, you take your chances." The pen stuttered in Ethan's hand, but the line filled anyway. He crossed the threshold and felt heat ghosts under his shoes. The hallway creaked, and a loose board winked a brass key at him. Ethan said, "I remember this," and the key felt familiar, like a word learned before birth. Colin called a time limit, and the air seemed to shrink in reply. Ethan pocketed the key, and the ash accepted the secret without protest. The records office hummed like a hive, fluorescent lights bleaching every hesitation to paper white. Ethan said, "I need permit files and storage listings under Cole," and the clerk waved toward the kiosks. He fumbled the brass key on his palm as if it might whisper a code. A woman at the next terminal glanced over with a curious tilt. Lena Park said, "If it's municipal storage, try legacy indexes first." Her voice held caffeine and confidence. Ethan said, "I'm chasing a voice in a lock with no door." She smiled like a problem solver, and not a judge. Lena said, "Door first, then voice," and began tapping in search fields faster than his fear could object. The shadow muttered that strangers want stories, not truth. Ethan said, "Why help me?" She shrugged and said, "Because someone helped me once." A result blinked alive, pointing to a shuttered facility by the shipyards. Ethan felt the map align with the key, and for a second the room seemed to warm. They met at the shipyards where wind licked salt onto every surface and gulls heckled the rust. The storage building squatted behind a chain-link fence, patched with mismatched wire. Ethan said, "This feels like a mistake dressed as a clue." Lena studied the lock cylinders and nodded toward a side gate. She said, "Maintenance walkways never get enough love." The brass key turned with a reluctant sigh, and the door exhaled cold dust. The shadow rose in him like fog and whispered, "Turn back while you still can." Ethan said, "I am done turning back," and the lights flickered awake in a grudging row. A corridor of corrugated mouths waited, each unit a sealed confession. Lena said number 217, and her voice steadied him more than he liked to admit. He saw their reflections warp in the metal, two figures stretched thin by old secrets. Ethan said, "If there's nothing inside, I'll have to face everything without proof." The thought almost broke him, which meant he had to try. Unit 217 rolled up with a groan that sounded like a throat cleared before confession. Inside, boxes labeled in a careful hand waited like patient elders. Ethan said he kept everything, and the ache in his chest shifted from anger to gravity. Lena knelt and opened a crate of tapes, each stamped with dates that bracketed his childhood. The shadow hissed that curated memories are knives. Ethan said, "I want the truth, even if it cuts." He found a reel, labeled with his name and a night he remembered only as silence. Lena said, "We can digitize these," and the word "we" steadied his breathing. On a shelf, a ledger held receipts and a brittle photo of a younger man carrying a sleeping child. Ethan said, "He was there, even when I could not see him." Tears threatened but did not fall, as if awaiting permission. The wind outside rattled the door and timed the moment like a metronome counting down to reckoning. They played one tape on a battered portable deck Lena kept for fieldwork, its motor whining like an old dog waking. A voice emerged, steady and tired, and called Ethan's name with the softness he had longed to deny. His father said, "If you're hearing this, it means I chose the fire over the lie." The words bent the air. The shadow flailed and tried to distort the syllables. Ethan said, "What lie?" And the tape answered with a name he had not expected. Colin Ward, the inspector, had signed permits for a retrofit that never happened. Funds moved, walls thinned, and safety was sold at a discount. The voice said, "I stayed to keep you alive." Ethan's hands shook, and rage braided with relief until both felt indistinguishable. Lena said, "We need copies in council." The deck clicked and the tape ended with a blank hiss that sounded like a threshold breathing. Ethan said, "This is bigger than grief," and finally let the tears fall. The sun fell low behind the shipyard cranes, bleeding rust light across the water. Ethan said it wasn't neglect. It was sabotage dressed as silence. Lena adjusted her glasses, scanning the ledger again. She said, "Your father wasn't running. He was shielding you from a fire he knew was coming." The tape had named Colin Ward, the inspector, as the man who buried the truth. Ethan's pulse hammered with the weight of betrayal. The shadow coiled and hissed that trust was a trap, that everyone was a liar. Ethan said, "I spent half my life blaming a ghost when the enemy had a face." Lena rested a hand briefly on his sleeve, steady and human. She said, "This doesn't end in storage. This ends in daylight." His breath misted in the cooling air, and he clutched the letter tighter. Ethan said, "Then daylight will have my father's voice too." The gulls scattered into the sky, as if carrying the vow upward. Inside a diner lit by buzzing neon, Ethan and Lena leaned over greasy menus, more as camouflage than appetite. Ethan said, "If Colin profited, others had to know." Lena tapped her pen against a napkin and began sketching a network of names from the ledger. She said, "See here, this trail leads to contractors who never filed receipts." The shadow snickered, that even proof bends under power. Ethan said, "How do you fight a system built to erase people like him?" His voice cracked with the tension of decades carried forward. Lena said, "With light, with records, with people who still believe truth matters." A waitress set down coffee, her eyes darting as if she sensed the storm in their booth. Ethan traced the ink line with a shaking finger. He said, "My father gave his life for this. I can't waste it." The diner clock hummed overhead, its ticking matching his determination beat for beat. The courthouse archive smelled of dust and disuse, its shelves groaning under forgotten truths. Ethan said, "We're trespassing in the bones of the city." Lena flicked her flashlight across rows of unlabeled binders. She said, "Sometimes bones are all that's left to prove the body lived." The shadow sneered, "That paper crumbles, justice with it." Ethan tugged open a drawer and pulled out a file stamped with red ink, "Pending inquiry, closed without action." His father's name appeared in the margins like a ghost whisper. Ethan said, "He tried," and they shut him down. His knuckles whitened around the file edges. Lena steadied him with a glance, then said, "Now we open what they closed." Rain pattered against the skylight, and dust swirled in the beam of her light. Ethan whispered, "This is the twist I never wanted but can't ignore." The silence after was not empty, it was complicit. Back at Mara Lynn's clinic, the tape hissed through old speakers, its words now heavy with context. Ethan said, he stood against them, and he paid with everything. Mara listened without interrupting, her eyes reflecting both grief and pride. She said, "He carried a burden meant for many, but chose to protect you first." The shadow whispered that sacrifice is just another word for abandonment. Ethan shook his head, pressing the ledger open on the table. He said, "No, he fought, and they buried him. I won't bury him again." Mara leaned closer, steady, and said, "Then the choice he left you was never about vengeance. It was about becoming more than pain." Ethan's chest rose and fell like surf, torn between rage and resolve. He said, "If truth is my inheritance, then I'll spend it loudly." The hum of the clinic here felt like a heartbeat in the silence that followed. Night stretched heavy as Ethan walked alone across the bridge, the city lights bleeding gold on the black river. The letter felt alive against his ribs, a pulse echoing his own. He said, "You stayed for me, now I'll stay for the truth." The shadow roared, desperate, telling him to let it drown, to walk away and forget. Ethan's stride did not falter. He said, "You can follow me, but you don't decide anymore." The wind whipped his jacket and rain spit sideways, stinging but clarifying. Each step felt like stitching a wound closed with thread made of resolve. He touched the rail and looked down at the reflection of neon shimmering in the water. Ethan said, "Tomorrow they'll hear his voice, and mine beside it." A siren wailed far off, but he kept walking, the city watching, the bridge carrying him forward into the unknown. Morning thinned the fog over the river as Ethan spread tapes, and the ledger across Mara's desk like a map of bruises. Ethan said, "Today I choose light over fire." Lena checked duplicate files on a portable drive, jaw set. Lena said, "We take this to the oversight hearing, then archive it everywhere." The shadow tested his ribs and promised safety in silence. Ethan said, "Silence kept me 12 for 20 years. Mara poured tea that smelled of mercy. Mara said, "Speak to the wound, not the wounder." Ethan nodded and touched the letter inside his jacket, feeling its edges like a compass. He rehearsed the facts until they sounded like weather, inevitable and real. Ethan said, "If my voice shakes, let it shake on record." Lena smiled without looking up. Lena said, "Shaking still counts as speaking." Sirens murmured far away, ordinary and unthreatening for once. Ethan drew a breath that felt earned and stood to leave. City Hall smelled like polished stone and old victories as the chamber filled with cameras. Ethan said, "My name is Ethan Cole, and I carry a voice you tried to bury." Colin Ward adjusted his tie with a smile learned from mirrors. Colin said, "We are all saddened by recent events, but hearsay will not rebuild walls." The shadow urged Ethan to spit rage, to make ruin his argument. Ethan said, "I have records, transfers, cancelled retrofits, and a tape that names beneficiaries." Lena cued audio and glanced at him like a lighthouse. The tape spilled his father's steady voice into the room, the words threading through marble and doubt. Gasps rose like birds startled from rafters. Colin said, out of context, edited, malicious. Ethan held up the ledger. Ethan said, "Context lives here in signatures and dates." The chair tapped a gavel, but the truth was already standing. Colin leaned toward the mic with a predator's patience. Colin said, "The deceased was under stress and mistaken, and this young man is grieving loudly." The words tried to make Ethan small enough to fold. The shadow reached for old shame. Ethan said, "Grief taught me to listen, not obey." He placed photocopies on the projector, each slide a stitch across a decades-long cut. Transfers flowed to shell companies with contractor names that never swung a hammer. Ethan said, "You approved work that vanished, and so did safety." Murmurs turned to voices with edges. Lena said, "Audio forensic checksum confirms integrity." A council member asked for the date of the first flagged permit. Ethan answered without stutter. Ethan said, "The night the alarms failed was bought in these columns." Colin's smile cracked like thin ice in spring. For the first time, Ethan felt taller than the story that once owned him. A sudden fire alarm shrieked, and lights strobed as if panic could edit facts. The chamber jolted to its feet, and fear tried to scatter their proof. The shadow shouted, "Run and keep the secret." Ethan said, "We walk, we do not run," and gathered the originals with hands that refused to shake. Lena said, "Backups are already mirrored offsite." Colin moved toward a side door with a phone pressed hard to his ear. Ethan said, "You don't get to exit before the truth lands." Security redirected the crowd, and the strobe froze faces into brief masks. Mara's words returned like a hand on his spine. Mara had said, "Choose becoming over burning." Ethan turned to a camera and spoke as if to his younger self. Ethan said, "If you are listening, Dad, I chose light today." The alarm cut, and the room exhaled in one long human sound. When order returned, the chair reconvened, and a prosecutor stepped forward like weather changing. Ethan said, "I will submit sworn testimony and full copies." The prosecutor nodded, already measuring the path ahead. Colin said, "This is a witch hunt staged by opportunists, but the room had learned a new grammar." Lena said, "Chain of custody documented," and placed drives into labeled envelopes. Ethan felt the letter warm against his chest, as if ink could generate heat. Ethan said, "Father, I forgive you for what I did not understand, and I forgive myself for the years I lost." The shadow tried one last whisper, and found no purchase. Cameras whirred, pens moved, and the gavel found wood like a door closing on the old life. Ethan said, "I will testify for anyone who can no longer speak." The city did not cheer, but it listened, and that sounded like beginning. Evening softened the courthouse steps, and the city sounded less like judgment and more like breath. Ethan said, "I expected victory to feel louder," and the quiet surprised him. Lena tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and scanned the sky for rain. Lena said, "Loud comes later when doors start opening." The shadow circled once and, finding no anchor, thinned like mist. Mara joined them with paper cups of tea, warm as a benediction. Mara said, "Resolution is not a trumpet, it is a pulse you choose to follow." Ethan touched the letter through denim and felt new edges forming inside him. He said, "If healing is a road, I want mile markers." Lena smiled and lifted her cup. Lena said, "Marker 1, we told the truth and we're still standing." Traffic hissed past like the ocean pretending to be streets. "Oh," Ethan said, "then I'll keep standing, even when no one is watching." The apartment shell stood quiet in morning gray, a rib cage of beams holding absence. Ethan said, "I kept you as a shrine to anger," and the words did not echo. A cleanup crew moved deliberately, turning wreckage into piles with names. He watched a single photograph edge freed from soot like a survivor. Ethan said, "I forgive what I could not know," and the sentence landed with unexpected gentleness. The shadow tested the perimeter, then sat down, smaller, almost thankful. A robin flashed across the cordon, a brief ember with wings. Ethan said, "You stayed to carry me through one more night," and the sky brightened by degrees. He placed a white flower on the curb where he had once paced. Ethan said, "I will live so this place becomes memory, not prison." The city inhaled, and for once he breathed in time with it. At the community center, folding chairs became a small parliament of the bruised. Ethan said, "If your testimony needs a spine, borrow mine," and the room changed shape. A grandmother raised a hand steady as a verdict and thanked him without ceremony. Lena stood by the projector with thorns and links and a plan drawn clean. Lena said, "We will file as a group, and we will not be ignored." The shadow warned that institutions digest bravery and call it paperwork. Ethan said, "Paperwork can be a sword if you swing it together." Murmurs grew into purpose with edges. He described dates, names, and how to keep copies in too many places to erase. Ethan said, "My father bought us time with courage, let's spend it well." Applause arrived carefully, then decided to stay. He felt the letter steady in his jacket like a compass that finally pointed home. They returned to the clinic at twilight, where rooms learned people's names and kept them safe. Mara set the tape deck on the table like an altarpiece. Ah, Mara said one last time, not to reopen the wound, but to bless the scar. Ethan nodded and pressed play, letting the familiar grain of his father's voice arrive. The message felt shorter now, maybe because the fear had been trimmed away. Ethan said, "You stayed. I heard you, and I will keep hearing you by how I live." The shadow listened, and did not argue. Mara folded her hands and offered the silence that follows a true prayer. Lena said, "Tomorrow, we scan every page and publish with context." Ethan smiled, light but firm. He said, "And I'll sleep without rehearsing what I should have said." Outside, the last light held the windows a minute longer, as if reluctant to leave. Near the river, night gathered without menace, and the bridge lights stitched a quiet seam across water. Ethan said, "Resolution costs, but the receipt is worth keeping," and he took out a pen. He wrote a letter on a page already creased by living. Ethan said, "Father, I will build something honest from the ashes you refused." Wind skimmed the surface and braided city neon into patient ribbons. He folded the page and placed it with the original, two truths sharing one pocket. Ethan said, "I will visit when the road blurs, and I will leave when it clears." The shadow, now small, sat beside him like a tired friend who finally trusts the driver. He stood and felt the world tilt toward morning even though night remained. Ethan said, "I am not finished, but I am begun," and walked toward a tomorrow he could meet without flinching. Dawn pulled soft gold over the city as Ethan crossed the square with the weight of night, finally lifted. Ethan said, "I am still here," and so is his voice. The fountain whispered against stone, carrying echoes of every truth spoken. Lena joined him with tired eyes, but a smile born of survival. Lena said, "We stood up, and the world listened longer than I thought it would." A group of neighbors walked past, nodding in quiet recognition. Ethan pressed the folded letter against his jacket and said, "I will carry him forward, not behind." The shadow, small and hushed, dissolved into the rising light. Birds lifted from power lines, scattering like released confessions. Ethan said, "Daylight doesn't erase scars, but it makes them easier to live with." His shoulders relaxed as if his body had waited decades for morning. The city exhaled, and he exhaled with it. Later that morning, Ethan visited the community archive, where rows of shelves awaited their new guardians. Ethan said, "Every story deserves a witness, even the painful ones." He slid a copy of the tapes into a labeled case. Lena scanned the ledger for upload, her fingers moving with quiet certainty. Lena said, "We'll make it harder for lies to outlive people." The hum of servers joined the room like a choir. Ethan said, "He gave me fire, but I'll give others light." A young volunteer carried boxes past and smiled shyly at Ethan, recognizing strength reshaped into service. The shadow was gone, leaving space for breath. Ethan whispered, "Your voice belongs to history now, not just to me." The archive lights blinked on, steady and enduring, as though promising to keep vigil long after he was gone. By midday, Ethan stood at the riverside where the bridge arched into sky. He said, "This is where silence tried to keep me." Wind rippled his jacket as he placed a fresh flower at the railing. Lena stayed a step behind, giving him room. He said, "I once thought forgiveness was weakness, but now it feels like breath." The water carried fragments of neon and sunlight together, unbothered by the past. Ethan said, "I will not let bitterness steer me anymore." The letter inside his pocket felt like a covenant seal. He touched the rail, cold and grounding, and whispered, "I forgive you, Dad, and I forgive the boy I was." The bridge did not answer, but it seemed to steady itself under his weight. For the first time, he did not look down in fear. He looked ahead, toward a horizon written in light. In the afternoon, Mara welcomed Ethan back to the clinic, the same room where silence once felt like weight. "Mara said the scar has closed, but its lesson remains." Ethan sat with a posture finally unguarded. Ethan said, "I came here a ghost, but I leave with marrow again." Mara poured tea, steam curling like memory reshaped. She said, You chose to live beyond grief, and that choice is what makes you whole. Ethan said, "The shadow taught me fear, but fear no longer holds the pen." Lena entered with files stacked under her arm, smiling as though already planning the next fight. Ethan said, "The past shaped me, but it doesn't own me anymore." Mara nodded, the quiet blessing in her eyes saying enough. The clock ticked, not as a threat but as rhythm, steady as life. Night returned, but this time it did not bite. Ethan stood on his balcony, overlooking the city, letter in one hand and pen in the other. Ethan said, "Every ending is a beginning disguised." He wrote a final note beneath his father's words, "I choose to rise." He folded the page carefully and placed it in a journal that smelled of fresh paper and possibility. Ethan said, "Wisdom isn't the absence of pain, it's the courage to keep walking with it." The city lights blinked back like patient stars. He breathed in, long and steady, no longer waiting for permission. The shadow was gone, leaving only his own voice, clear and steady. Ethan said, "This is where the story changes, but not where it ends." He closed the journal, set it beside him, and let the night carry him forward into peace.